Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, both here and online. I'm Ariel Tham from the Malaysia program at RSIS. Welcome to this seminar on rising US-China competition, economic implications for Malaysia by Dr. Kian Ming. Strategic competition between the US and China has grown in recent years. Economically, the US and its European allies and Indo-Pacific allies have sought to secure and diversify their supply chains from China. This and China's response have opened up new opportunities and challenges for Southeast Asia. What does this mean for Malaysia? What are the recent trends in FDI and Malaysia's trade and investment promotion strategies in response to global and regional competition? What are the most important features of the economic initiatives and agreements that have been signed or are underway, ranging from IPEF to RCEP for Malaysia? To discuss this, we are honored to have with us today Dr. Ong here in person and Dr. Tham Yean via Zoom as our discussant. You would have seen their bios, but briefly, Dr. Ong is MP for Bangi since 2018 and previously MP for Sedang from 2013 to 2018. He was Deputy Minister of International Trade and Investment and Industry, from 2018 to 2020. Previously, he was a lecturer at USCI University. He was a policy researcher at think tanks and a consultant at BCG KL. Dr. Tham is Professor Emeritus at UKM and visiting senior fellow at ISEAS Singapore. She was director and professor at ICMASC UKM. She has served as a consultant to national and international agencies, including the World Bank and ADB. Dr. Ong will speak, followed by Dr. Tham. We will have a roundtable discussion after that, followed by a Q&A with our audience. For those online, please send in your questions through the Q&A function. This event is recorded and may be made publicly available later. Now, Dr. Ong, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Ariel, for inviting me to share some thoughts, especially updated thoughts on what I think is an important point of discussion, not just in Malaysia, not just for Malaysia, but for the rest of Southeast Asia as well. Thank you very much to RSIS for this opportunity to come here in person and also to speak to you online, and also to Yean. Good to touch base with you virtually and hope to see you in person soon. I'm going to go through a couple of points here in about 10 to 15 minutes. I'd like to start with the overview slide. So the slide after this would highlight some of the points I'm going to make. The first point, next slide please. The first point I'm going to make is to contextualize, to contextualize very briefly foreign policy engagement with China and the US from an economic standpoint, from Najib all the way to Ismail Sabri, with Dr. Mahathir in between, who was the Prime Minister of the time when I was a Deputy Minister. And the second point I'd like to make is to just briefly show some of the FDI trends in Malaysia since 2018 and some of my own personal projections moving forward. The third area I'd like to touch on is free trade agreement strategies under different premiers in Malaysia, and what are some of the trajectories moving forward for Malaysia pre and also post 15 general election. And then I would like to offer some preliminary views on the foreign policy strategy under the current Prime Minister, Ismail Sabri, that is still developing and will continue to evolve over the next year or so if he manages to stay on as Prime Minister. And then lastly, some domestic political developments under this current Prime Minister and the impact on economic as well as foreign policy strategy moving forward. Next. So just briefly, I think Najib's strategic engagement from a foreign policy standpoint is well known to many who have observed him and also Malaysian politics since he became Prime Minister in 2011. We saw, of course, aggressive promotion of Belt and Road related initiatives, whether it's directly related to BRI that got the endorsement of the Chinese government, such as the ECRL and the twin industrial parks in Kuantan as well as in China, and then also some private initiatives with government support in Malaysia, such as the establishment of the foreign branch campus of Xiamen University in Malaysia. At the same time, Najib was also very careful in making sure that he had access to friends in the US as well, and he was very supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as part and parcel of a larger, outreach to President Obama under the US administration's Asian pivot. And then thirdly, which would be relevant to the audience here in Singapore, I think Najib ushered in what I would think is a very good time in terms of relations between Malaysia and Singapore, resolve some of the outstanding issues that were not able to be resolved under previous prime ministers, including the Tanjung Pagar KTM station here in Singapore. Also rolled out initiatives to cooperate on the Iskandar development region, including cooperation between the two sovereign wealth funds, Khazanah as well as Temasek, and then of course the KL Singapore high-speed rail project that has since been put aside by the current governments in both countries. On Dr. Mahathir, moving forward to Dr. Mahathir, over the 22 months of a Pakatan Harapan government, with regards to managing relations with China, I think right from the start, there was pressure on Dr. Mahathir's administration to repair relations with China because of some of the things that he, as well as other leaders under Pakatan Harapan, said about certain Belt and Road projects in Malaysia, including, for example, saying that the wall around the Alliance Steel project in Kuantan had to be torn down. That was something that he said, Dr. Mahathir said before the 14th general election. And, this is part and parcel of how once Pakatan Harapan became government, we had to make sure that we had to send the right signals to the Chinese government to say that we were very supportive of continued and increased investments coming from China. And I think that was ably handled, I think, to a large degree. And Chinese investments continue to come to Malaysia, as I'll show later under the FDI statistics. Under Dr. Mahathir, there was much more ambivalence about the CPTPP as well as other FTAs. And one of the reasons why Dr. Mahathir was skeptical about ratifying the CPTPP, even though the US was no longer part of it after Trump pulled out, was that he saw, or he understood CPTPP from a political angle rather than from an economic angle, in a sense that he understood CPTPP as, or TPP rather, as something that Najib negotiated with the US government, partly as a way in which Najib could perhaps leverage on his relationship with President Obama so that the investigations on 1MDB could be slowed down under the Obama administration. So this is something that was very difficult, especially for me as Deputy Minister at MITI, who was trying to promote more discussions on FTAs and also pushing for the ratification of CPTPP, which Malaysia had already signed up for but had not ratified. There was no great effort by Dr. Mahathir to engage with the US because of his obvious distaste for President Trump and his various different ways of engaging with the domestic as well as foreign audience, that's President Trump. And of course, vis-a-vis Singapore, there's going back to old issues, which I think did not really, improve or perhaps, put the Malaysia-Singapore relations, a couple of steps back, especially for those of us who wanted the younger people in the Pakatan Harapan administration that wanted to, move forward and to have new visions and new cooperation and partnerships with Singapore. So the re-emergence of the water and the Crooked Bridge issues, frankly, to me, were things that distracted from the larger agenda of pursuing more economic cooperation, especially through FDI that was coming to the region. Now we move on to Ismail Sabri. The term that I use is flexible engagement, and this is reflected in his approach to domestic politics, where he's happy to engage with anyone and everyone in order to stay in power, in order to maintain his relevance, and in order to increase his international profile. So for the domestic audience, Ismail Sabri signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the Pakatan Harapan parties that allowed him to stay on in power in relative stability until at least July. And I think he would want to extend his tenure as Prime Minister until at least until July, which is something that is still under discussion within his own party and also with the opposition parties. He was very happy to attend the first US-ASEAN meeting with President Biden in DC recently, and he was also in Johor to attend the launch of the US Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, where he made a speech which included very positive signals and affirmation of Malaysia's intent to ratify the CPTPP this year, after the ratification of RCEP was completed in January of this year. And then I speculate, foreign policy strategy under Ismail Sabri to be similar to the Keluarga Malaysia or the Malaysian family Big Ten concept, which was launched soon after he became Prime Minister or almost immediately. But the details or the substance of this plan or this framework or this logo or slogan were only slowly disclosed by absorbing proposals and ideas that came along the way to him and his advisors. Okay, next, just quickly, this public information that is from the MIDA's investment performance reports. MIDA is the agency in charge of attracting foreign investments to Malaysia. And you can see from 2017 up to 2020, for manufacturing projects, the largest destination country was China, followed by the countries that you see there, usually from Europe, US, as well as Singapore. Singapore being one of the sources by which not just Singapore investments were channeled to Malaysia, but also investments from other countries using Singapore as a base. And these are approved investments. Not all of this have been realized. It is a trend that I would have expected to continue to see in 2021 as well as 2022, if not for the COVID pandemic. But because of the COVID pandemic and also because of other global factors, which we can discuss later, China fell to 4th place in 2021. And the E&E boom globally, and also the US-China tensions, as well as European-China tensions, resulted in a lot of investments that were coming through to the region in the E&E sector, especially given focus in Malaysia, especially in Penang and Kulim, where the E&E ecosystem is already pretty robust. That is why you can see investments coming from the Netherlands, from Singapore, either directly or indirectly, even a place like Austria, because of one or two of their large-scale E&E companies operating in Penang and Kulim. You can see that the impact of this is probably continued investments from Europe and US overtaking China in the next couple of years, especially let's say China does not have a more realistic policy with regards to handling COVID domestically. And the reason why this is important is because as long as restrictions remain in China with regards to overseas travel, it will be difficult for Chinese companies and their representatives to come to the region, to have meetings, to scout out investment sites and whatnot. And this means that the level of approval and, more importantly, the implementation and execution of China-related manufacturing projects, not just in Malaysia, but in Southeast Asia, would definitely slow down over the next couple of years. Coming to the end already, free trade agreement strategy since 2018. I said earlier how Dr. Mahathir was ambivalent about CPTPP for reasons I already explained earlier. And also something to add is that I think he was badly advised on the economic pros and cons of the CPTPP. And because of this, this colored Dr. Mahathir's administration's perception on other FTAs. So, for example, the European Union was trying very hard to push for reopening of discussions between Malaysia and EU on FTAs. But as long as we couldn't resolve the debate on the CPTPP, whether to ratify it or not, it was impossible for MITI to have a position on whether to open up talks with the EU. For RCEP, we continued along with the negotiations on RCEP, partly because of our obligations within ASEAN, but there was a very noticeable absence in terms of strategic discussion on FTAs, and I can talk more about this later as well. For Muhyiddin, under Muhyiddin's premiership, FTAs took a backseat, obviously because of COVID-19 related issues. But I think positively for those advocates of free trade, Azmin Ali, the new MITI minister, who's still the MITI minister, backed the ratification of CPTPP publicly, even though he objected to this internally in cabinet when he was the Minister of Economic Affairs under Dr. Mahathir. It was also during Azmin Ali's time as MITI minister that the RCEP legislation changes in Parliament were passed at the end of last year, at the end of 2021. And then, RCEP was signed during Muhyiddin's administration. It should be November 2021, not 2020, apologies. And then FTA negotiations with the European Free Trade Association that comprises Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, as well as Iceland, they were not really prioritized. It was at the 11th round during Muhyiddin's administration, and now it is at the 12th round that was recently concluded in Geneva. But this doesn't get much airplay because it's not really covered by the news, and also the political, the politicians don't really, give focus on this compared to the CPTPP. So under Ismail Sabri, I think he will continue to have a flexible approach as per his domestic policy approach towards FTAs. I think he would be open to reopening discussions with EU on future FTAs after the ratification of CPTPP later this year. And I think this is a positive development for those people who are interested to further the free trade agenda in Malaysia, especially since Malaysia will face a lot of intra-ASEAN competition, including from Vietnam, who is already ratified CPTPP. Okay, last two slides. Foreign policy under Ismail Sabri, I think flexible engagement would continue to rule the day. He'll look for quick wins whenever and wherever possible. I think he's willing to discuss any reasonable proposal that is put on his table or the table of his advisors. He will never say no initially. And I think this is reflective of his approach towards domestic politics. I think there is currently a temporary shift in prioritization of engagement with the US and EU compared to China, given that China is still occupied with COVID-19 and other domestic issues. And then, like I said before, Ismail Sabri and his advisors will continue to pick and choose different concepts from the Keluarga Malaysia Big Ten approach to absorb into his foreign policy strategy. Last, IS is Ismail Sabri. I think he'll continue to want to push elections until next year. And then he'll continue to look for quick wins and further opportunities, including with world leaders. The use of Bahasa Malaysia will continue at the international agenda, but this is purely focused on the domestic political agenda and will not have a great impact in terms of Malaysia's larger outreach strategy. Perhaps only from a person-to-person kind of relationship, I think Ismail Sabri may not have the same kind of gravitas as somebody like Najib or even Muhyiddin, especially since his command of English is not as good as previous prime ministers. Okay, lastly, I think the weakness of the current government means that other ministers and parties can influence their own corner of domestic policy, and this also can have an impact on foreign engagements. whether it's in the area of foreign labor, export of renewable energy, defense contracts. And this is where I think different ministers have the opportunity to propose their own agendas and their own preferences to the Prime Minister. And because of the flexible approach that the Prime Minister is taking, the chances that these kinds of proposals would get more traction and would be passed at the cabinet level would be higher compared to before. Okay, so I'll stop here for now and pass it on to Ariel or Siew. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. Now can we move on to Dr. Tham, please?
Thank you, Ariel, for your kind words of introduction. And I would also like to thank RSIS for kind invitation to be the discussant at this seminar. First, I'd like to thank Ming for a very succinct synthesis of the foreign policy stance under the 3 different administrations. I think he has summarized the points very well, especially the flexible arrangement under the current administration. I would like to confine my discussion to look to 3 aspects, looking at Malaysia's engagement with China, since economic diplomacy is a very important portion of foreign policy, and Malaysia's engagement with the US, as well as the last one, Malaysia's engagement with EU, as I think the EU is very important as a diversification strategy for Malaysia. Before I start, I would like to emphasize that I think that throughout all 3 administrations and as well as previous administrations, that Malaysia has embraced generally open and trade and investment. That the trade, I think Malaysia recognizes, Malaysia is recognized as a trading nation, and the FDI is an important component of the economic strategies. So even though Mahathir did not or was ambivalent towards CPTPP, he is actually in favor of, for example, ASEAN, the RCEP, as well as East Asian integration because of his Look East policy 1.0 and the 2.0. So I think that in general, Malaysia has an open trade and investment regime. And we can see that in terms of Malaysia's engagement with China. If we look at the trade and investment links, China is Malaysia's largest trading partner for more than 10 years. And it is an important supplier of intermediate inputs for production in the country. And of course, Malaysia's engagement with BRI is extensive. It is extensive in terms of its sectoral coverage and its geographical coverage. That means it is not confined to just one sector, neither is it confined to just West Malaysia alone or the West Coast. It straddles to the East Coast of Malaysia as well as East Malaysia. So the sectoral coverage is not confined to even certain subsectors alone. For example, within services, we can see Chinese investment is very important in real estate, as in other countries of Southeast Asia. And it is also important in the education sector, as Dr. Ong has explained in the establishment of the Xiamen University, even though this was actually pre-BRI. But more importantly, in the digital free trade zone that was established for the development of the e-commerce logistics center for ASEAN, and Alibaba's engagement with through China in the development of this e-commerce fulfillment center. And of course, we also see that in the Chinese platforms and how well they are doing in the country, such as Shopee and Lazada. So in the new forms of economic engagement, such as on e-commerce, we can see extensive Chinese presence in the country, not just in terms of platforms, but also in terms of e-wallet. For example, Touch and Go has a collaboration with Ant Financial China for developing the e-wallet, touch and go e-wallet uses Alipay, actually, Alipay technology. So in the old sectors as well as in the new sectors, we see China being very extensive in Malaysia, and is of course extensive in manufacturing from as Dr. Ong has explained, not just in terms of approved investment, but in terms of actual investment. We can see that, for example, in not just stainless steel car production, but also solar development. Solar development, the recent energy greenfield investment in solar is substantial. And if we look at current developments, such as Biden and his recent announcement that it would suspend the tariffs for 24 months for the solar imports from countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, that may generate even more relocation of solar projects from China to Malaysia, albeit because of the COVID, this may slow down a bit, but when China has managed its COVID better, hopefully by next year, then we may see a different story. And we see also strong people-to-people movements, tourists, students, private higher education has a large presence of Chinese students in the country. We also see in the Malaysia, my second home, it was very popular before it was suspended. So we see that in actual trade and investment flows, people flows. If we look at government-to-government engagement, we are not just part of RCEP alone. We are also part of the ASEAN Plus agreements, and that includes ASEAN-China FTAs, which are being upgraded. So we are part of that link. And there are also the 5-year program for economic and trade cooperation between Malaysia and China. First round from 2013 to 2017, the second round from 2018 to 2022. And I believe that there is this concentration or focus on the twin parks, the MCKIP in Malaysia and the Jingzhou in China. So there's active cooperation at the bilateral level also. And if we are looking at, for example, the possibility of the ratification of the CPTPP in Malaysia, we have to remember that China has also applied to join the CPTPP. And if that actualizes, then we will also be linked with China through the CPTPP. So we have extensive commercial links with China and extensive G2G engagement. On the other hand, when we look at Malaysia's engagement with the US, it's mainly in the commercial links. US is an important trade and investment partner of Malaysia also. The US is Malaysia's third largest trading partner after China and Singapore, and it is also an important investment partner in the E&E sector. We see the upgrade in Intel investment in Malaysia as approved last year. It's a substantial investment. So the E&E sector is very important, and US investment supports this, and there's also US investment in services, which is very important also. Of course, in terms of G2G, we don't have this engagement because one, the Malaysia-US FTA that failed during Mahathir's first administration as Prime Minister. So that makes me think that actually Mahathir is perhaps his anti-West sentiments may influence how he looks at Malaysia's engagement with the US in terms of free trade agreements, apart from what Dr. Ong has said that he has been badly advised on the CPTPP. We know also, of course, part of the problem with not having any formal engagements with G2G engagement with US is because of Trump, the exit from the TPP, and subsequent to Obama's pivot to Asia, there's actually no engagement with Southeast Asia at all. But we can see that both the US and China wants to engage with Southeast Asia and Malaysia. We can see that in the COVID vaccine diplomacy recently, that countries rush to assist the supply of vaccines to Southeast Asia, maybe for the US, the expired or near to expired vaccine. But nevertheless, it is also used as part of the tool of foreign policy. So when we look at the lack of formal engagement, that comes to the point of that was raised by Dr. Ong, the IPAF, the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity is actually very important in 2022 because it's the first formal attempt to re-engage Southeast Asia during the Biden administration. Unfortunately, it's a very different form of engagement. It's not a traditional free trade agreement. It doesn't have any tariff concessions, and it seeks to increase economic disciplines in the 4 pillars that they have raised. So therefore, although Malaysia and Southeast Asia welcome this as a signal of re-engagement, it's actually a bit unclear as to how this can serve to improve G to G, because the framework is vague, it's not very clear as to what it amounts to at this point in time. So therefore, my first question is actually, in your opinion, Dr. Ong, do you think the IPAF will be able to add value to Malaysia beyond the existing regional architecture and bilateral engagement with the US, such as what we have, the TIFA? Will we be able to really successfully negotiate this type of new economic cooperation on higher disciplines, rules and regulations, rather than market access, given that in general, some of the issues that the US is interested in, such as, for example, labor, human rights, and all these are very difficult issues for developing countries, including Malaysia. So will it be able to add value in what form? Will it end up with the development of a separate supply chain with the US that will seek to exclude China? And how will this affect Malaysia, which is very dependent on China for intermediate inputs and for the supply chain developments in this side of the world? My second question is actually, will the IPAF be able to counter Malaysia's existing engagement with China through trade and investment links, given the numerous projects that are going on in the RCEP, even with the slowdown in China over the COVID and the slowdown in investment because of practical reasons, as you have explained? Will we actually be able to use IPAF in any way to counter this, our dependence on China for trade and investment? And will we be able to continue to use Chinese investments for short-term and long-term benefits, if there are any? Now I come to the third point on the engagement with the EU. EU is also an important trading partner, about 10% of our trade. But for me, I think the EU is a very important to consider because of we can use it for diversification between the US and China. But we know that the negotiation with EU, which started in 2010, has been on and off for various reasons. So even though the government has announced in March 2022 that it will take steps to resume negotiations for the Malaysia-EU FTA, if we look at the outstanding issues that were deterrents in the negotiations before, such as government procurement, Bumiputra policy, intellectual property rights, and the issues that concern EU, such as labor rights, labor issues, environment, all these are very difficult issues for Malaysia. And the issue of forced labor in Malaysia is still something that the country is grappling with. And then, of course, we have the sustainability issues, the cap that's put on the import of palm oil that will qualify as renewable energy. So although the EU is still importing palm oil from Malaysia, will the sustainability issues such as deforestation, will that be also a stumbling block in the negotiations? So given all these issues, do you think that we will be able to successfully conclude an agreement with the EU in the foreseeable future, especially under this administration where many of the issues have not been addressed? My last question is actually on net flows of FDI into Malaysia. If we look at actual data, the Bank Negara data for 2021, it showed an incredible rebound from 14.6 billion to 55 billion. And actually, it's not just a jump, but the fact that it stopped the decline in FDI into the country, according to the BOP data, from 2016 to 2020. So it arrested that decline. So I would like to know your opinion. What do you think contributed to this rebound? Can it be sustained? And what needs to be done to sustain this rebound? I also would like to know your opinion on the use of incentives, as well as the special budget allocation of 2 billion to attract strategic FDI. Do you think that Malaysia is actually spending a lot to attract FDI? And is this a sustainable strategy? And what sort of other strategies should we use to attract FDI into the country for the future? Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for all that that has been raised. I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Dr. Tham. And I see that there are many questions for you, Dr. Ong. Yes. I also have some of mine, but I think I'll let you answer her first.
Okay, thanks, Yean. As usual, very pertinent questions and insightful questions raised. And I'll try to answer them in a way that can present what I think is a coherent narrative with regards to the challenges for Malaysia moving forward on the economic integration aspects. On the first question about the value of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to Malaysia, and some of the challenges that Malaysia may face from the different pillars that has been identified under IPEF, and also relating that to some of the issues you raised about sustainability in the EU. I would say this, I would say from a economic and foreign policy standpoint, this is something that is positive. I see it as a glass half full strategy of engagement by the Biden administration towards East Asia as well as towards Asia as well as Southeast Asia to re-engage after many years of absence under the Trump presidency. And even though there were no tariff reduction kind of promises set out in the IPEF, I think that given Biden's domestic political constraints, this is probably the best that he could have done. And this may, I think, open the door for future consideration for reapplication, for re-entry into CPTPP by either the Biden administration or perhaps a future administration led by somebody who is, wants to continue the engagement with Asia. So this is something that I've said publicly in other areas, and I think that Malaysia's own responsibility towards IPEF is actually to address and to think about what strategic areas we can actually extract from this agreement, including some of the possible funding collaborations. And this does not only apply to IPEF, but it also applies to some of the funding proposals and potential for economic collaboration with the EU through the Global Gateway initiative that was launched a couple of years ago. And with the current push for more sustainability investments and FDI initiatives under the EU, this is something that I think should be seen as a larger coherent policy move that needs to be undertaken by Malaysia. And I think I'm somewhat optimistic that we can head towards this direction, because under previous as well as current government administrations, the push for SDGs continue to be very strong, right? And this is something, based on my experience in government, once the discussion and the frameworks and the policies that have been outlined through the Sustainable Development Goals have been sort of like ingrained and put into part and parcel of government policy in all ministries, in Malaysia. I think this is something that heralds well, but of course, the Malaysian government needs to provide leadership in terms of implementation and execution of some of these SDG and sustainability related goals, and to tie it in together with IPEF as well as the Global Gateway initiative by the EU. Going along the lines of questioning on IPEF and having to perhaps choose between US and China, I actually don't really think that Malaysia is being asked to choose. Of course, I think the US would prefer it if Malaysia could explicitly take a more pro-US position, including on the business side, but that is not likely to happen because of the importance of China, like you said, Yean as a trading as well as FDI partner. So I would actually look at it from a different point of view, and I would say that IPEF actually allows more possibility for Malaysia to further integrate our supply chain with Chinese companies. So you mentioned the solar sector as one important sector, and you also, I think, correctly point out that the exemption from some of the tariffs on solar panels that has been extended to 4 Southeast Asian countries, including Malaysia, would prompt more Chinese investments, and as well as investments coming from other places in the solar space to Malaysia. And here I want to highlight that it's not just solar companies in the solar PV space that may come to Malaysia, although there are some already in Malaysia, but more importantly, some of the solar glass manufacturers or glass manufacturers that provide their supplies to American companies such as First Solar, that has a huge presence in Kulim, that produces solar PVs to be exported globally, including to the United States, right? So the fact that Malaysia and other parts of Southeast Asia can attract this kind of investments and perhaps skirt some of the attention or the tariffs that the US may impose directly on operations by Chinese companies based in China would also be a positive trend for Malaysia and Southeast Asia. But the caveat is that we need to continue to maintain enough of a strategic importance that the US administration, either under Biden or somebody else, would not want to punish countries that are attracting Chinese investments in Southeast Asia, right, by using tariffs and other non-tariff measures. So this is something that we need to continue to look out for. And I think this is an important area to also compare with EU investments coming in these areas as well, because integration with Chinese companies may not take place in China, but in Southeast Asia. And if, let's say, the EU countries are taking a less harsh position, or at least from a policy standpoint, will not be so punitive compared to the United States, this is where I think a lot of the action can take place from an economic integration standpoint, right? So I hope this answers some of your questions in regards to IPEF, as well as and its impact on investments coming into Malaysia as well as Southeast Asia. I also want to say quickly about China BRI projects in Malaysia and perhaps also in Southeast Asia. It is undeniable that the investment flows, especially from an implementation and on the ground kind of standpoint, has slowed down significantly in Malaysia. I do not see major announcements of Chinese companies opening up any major facilities in Malaysia. And in fact, many of the existing applications, even before COVID, in 2018 and 19, on some of the big projects that were announced either in the paper processing industry or in the glass processing industry. Basically, all these projects have slowed down significantly. I don't think they would be able to be finished, even within 2021 or 2022, as long as the kind of travel restrictions, continue to happen in China. So I do agree with you to say that once China opens up, and we don't know when that will be, a lot of the investment interests would definitely flow out, coming into Malaysia and Southeast Asia. But I think these kinds of uncertainties continue to plague the supply chain and the implementation of many of these projects. So on the ground, BRI projects, I think at best have been sort of like put on a very, very slow back burner. Perhaps a slow implementation and execution on one of them, would be ECRL. Some progress, but I think much behind schedule. And yeah, on other BRI projects, I think not much development. Maybe as a last point, on the issues of FDI net flows, why do the Bank Negara numbers show a rebound in 2021? I think one of the reasons is because Bank Negara data is not only FDI from a manufacturing approved standpoint, but actual FDI inflows from the perspective of capital inflows into the country, in terms of buying assets here in Malaysia, as well as buying equipment and also buying infrastructure to set up factories and whatnot. So I think the data that you showed is reflective of probably a lot of EU as well as American investments coming into Malaysia in real terms and in live terms, so to speak, in 2021. And I expect that trend to continue in 2022 as well. On the use of incentives, just to wrap up, the 2 billion that was announced by Pakatan Harapan, this was under the previous Finance Minister, Lim Guan Eng, and that continues to be sort of like the trend that is being executed under the current Finance Minister. The incentives are actually not money that we pay out. It's basically just tax incentives and exemptions. The actual money that we give out in terms of grants, training grants, for example, it's over a long period of time. And there are KPIs that MIDA would set along the way. So if let's say you recruit or you employ a certain number of high-skilled personnel, including Malaysians, there's a quota for all of these things, then a certain amount of training grants will be given to you. And this is training grants in the form of cash grants, right? So that actually takes place over a long period of time, and 2 billion is actually not very much. And the investments come to Malaysia and in Southeast Asia, I think, from these sources, not because of the tax incentives from the perspective of cash grants. Maybe in Singapore it's a little bit different because there's a lot of subsidies for high-skilled workers. But Malaysia, I think companies go there because of other factors such as the ecosystem, logistics, as well as value for money labor. So I'll stop there for now and then maybe pass it to Ariel.
Thank you, Kian. Thank you so much. I have a few questions for both you and Dr. Tham. The first is on the CPTPP or TPP. You mentioned Dr. Mahathir's concerns listening to the various groups, but of course these concerns have been around for a long time, and these lobby groups have also been around for a long time. I have heard, when the US was in, there were concerns about them. When the US went out, there are concerns that then what is the value of that agreement for Malaysia now that the US is out? So if you could clarify for us some of the kind of long-standing concerns for certain lobby groups, and overall, I think it seems that Malaysia will probably go ahead, but it would be nice for us to hear how these concerns have always come into play in some ways. That's number one. Number two is on the regional dynamics. So as Deputy Minister, how did you view the efforts for trade and investment promotion of, let's say, countries like Vietnam and Indonesia? How do you see them doing it, and how do you see Malaysia being able to adapt to this regional competition that is also coming up? What did Malaysia have that is a comparative advantage for you? Thirdly, related to Indonesia, I guess, is the long-standing labor issues. And this has also got to do with labor flows in the region, and how, if the two of you don't fix that, that is a big issue for Malaysia as well. Even though, you know, if you could solve this, at least manage these problems, then it's probably good for both countries. But, you know, again, this migrant worker issue has been around for at least 2-3 decades, you know. So it would be nice to hear from you. But fourthly, it seems to me, and Dr. Tham had also stressed that, you know, Malaysia's trade policy has always been open, you know, and I think your fundamentals, your trade policy, even your foreign policy fundamentals is consistent, and it's been implemented and left to the officials very often. So even when you have different ministers or even different governments, you know, these fundamentals are there, and I don't really see much you know, fundamental policy difference between Pakatan Harapan parties and BN, except of course when you are led by Dr. Mahathir, then he has his, you know, quite personal sort of approach to a number of issues. But you know, maybe you could let us know whether or not there are differences, right? And what is the interplay between your public servants and how they, I guess, see themselves as the custodians of, you know, this kind of policy stability and consistency and predictability, which I think a lot of them kind of value, right? That they are safeguarding that, particularly on the foreign policy front. So these are my 4 questions, which I hope you and Dr. Tham find useful to address. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel. I'll address those and these first, and then pass it to Yean to add on. And I'm glad that you asked all these questions, because I think one of the value-added kind of insights, hopefully, that I bring to the table is my experience as the former deputy minister, having to you know, tackle and grapple with many of these issues, you know, internally within my ministry, and also with other cabinet members. On the CPTPP, you're right that you know, these kinds of concerns have been around for a long time, and the lobby groups, for example, who are anti-free trade agreements, include many different sort of like groups and personalities. So you know, one group would be the NGO sector, and these are you know, people that are associated with, for example, the Third World Network, for example, the late Martin Kor, and then of course an influential economist in Malaysia, Professor Jomo, you know, who has you know, contributed a lot of views on this. I think the difference between previous administrations and Dr. M's administration was that under Pakatan, you know, people like Martin Kor and also Professor Jomo had a much more influential voice within the administration, not just through Dr. Mahathir, but also through other ministers, including Azmin Ali, including people in PKR, who were more you know, enamored with some of these arguments. And this was one of the key reasons why I think Dr. Mahathir was badly advised on the CPTPP with regards to some of the cons, such as the investor-state dispute settlement. You know, really, you know, some of these individuals created, I think, an irrational fear, not just among Dr. Mahathir, but also my minister, Darrell Liking, that if we, you know, sign on to CPTPP, you know, this would mean opening up the floodgates for foreign MNCs to start suing the Malaysian government at the federal as well as the state level. And the reality is that these are overblown fears, because no multinational that's investing in Malaysia or any other country in Southeast Asia will want to take government to court willy-nilly, because they have long-term continued interest to operate in Malaysia and to want to have good ties with the Malaysian state, with the Malaysian government at the state and federal levels. And you know, when we gave examples to Dr. Mahathir, that the only 2 instances where Malaysia has been taken to court, you know, over not free trade agreements, but these bilateral investment treaties, was by very, very niche players. One guy who was unhappy with, a guy in Belgium was unhappy with the way Dr. Mahathir implemented the fixing of the exchange rates during the Asian financial crisis. And there was another Italian company that had dispute with the Malaysian government because they recovered some sunken wreckage of the you know, in the Straits of Malacca, and they wanted to have full rights over it. So these are not MNCs; these are, you know, very, very random kind of examples. But somehow the larger narrative that was being played was that once you sign up to these free trade agreements, that somehow the Malaysian government will be exposed to many of these lawsuits by multinational players, which I think was totally irresponsible. I was somewhat circumscribed from saying things a little bit more openly because there were internal disagreements even within my own ministry, including between me and also some of the ministers' staff on this particular issue. So these lobby groups still exist. Another lobby group that I can point out to is some people in Khazanah that were not so supportive of liberalization in certain procurement policies that had to do with GLCs. And initially, they were resisting it quite strongly. Under Pakatan Harapan, I could see that there may have been a slight shift whereby Khazanah was much more hands-off because they had a new CEO. And I think what was also interesting for me was to note that initially Petronas seemed to have certain reservations, especially under the TPP. But under PH, there may have been a little bit of not so active resistance because I think Petronas saw that they had interest in, for example, Canada, that needed to be protected as well, and CPTPP may assist them in that regard. So there are all these interesting changing dynamics that need to be given nuance, and I hope that I've given a flavor with regards to CPTPP. You have a very interesting question on regional dynamics vis-a-vis how Malaysia tries to, or perhaps should or did try to differentiate itself from Indonesia as well as Vietnam. I think some of the inherent advantages of Malaysia are well known to foreign investors. We have relatively good policies, relatively transparent policies, good value for labor, value for money labor, in the sense that we have skilled labor in an English-speaking environment that is very attractive to MNCs. And our levels of corruption, I think, were within tolerable range compared to, let's say, Vietnam and Indonesia. But that being said, I think, I myself clearly saw Vietnam and Indonesia as very strong competitors as well as opportunities. I'm a bit sorry to not have enough time to be in government to actually put some policy suggestions through with regards to trade and investment integration with both of these countries from a Malaysian perspective. So I'll just give you one brief example. During my time as Deputy Minister, Vietnam launched their first national car under VIN Group VIN. But one of the things that I told my guys at the operational level, including some of the related agencies, was, look, Vietnam, yes, they can launch their car, but the automotive components will have to come from somewhere. And it was quite well known during that time that Vietnam did not have the internal capacity to manufacture a significant proportion of their components, whether it's seat belts, car seats, and things like that. So the two countries in the region that were best placed to supply some of these components was Thailand and Malaysia. And this is where we needed to think about sending a delegation to Vietnam to explore these opportunities. In fact, I was planning such a delegation before the change in government in 2020. Indonesia, of course, another unexplored, not unexplored, but another market that Malaysia needs to integrate itself much more towards, especially trying to tap into the thinking and the evolution of the unicorns in Indonesia, and to see how much of that can be brought back or applied to Malaysia. The third question is with regards to some of the labor issues. I think those are still ongoing. I would say that the challenge for Malaysia is actually to recognize that we cannot continue to depend on the free-flowing supply of labor from Indonesia, because the wages in Indonesia are increasing as well. They've increased their own minimum wage. And our choices would be to diversify our sources of foreign labor to include countries like Myanmar, for example. Of course, Bangladesh and Nepal continues to be favorite sectors, favorite employment source countries for security as well as for the manufacturing sector. So we may have to pivot towards that other countries. But at the same time, I think we also have to think about our whole land use strategy. Do we want to continue to depend on palm oil plantations, especially in Peninsular Malaysia where land is scarcer? Do we want to try to find ways to automate some of the processes using AI, using drones technology, for example, using image capture to try to improve, even self-driving machines, to try to improve the fruit harvesting processes in Malaysia, and then in the palm oil sector. And then the last one trade policy and fundamentals, yes, we've always been open. We continue to be open under all administrations. But I'll give you a couple of specific examples as to how Pakatan Harapan, under MITI as well as MOF, changed some of our policies to expedite the processing of FDI applications. So in the past, there was all FDI applications had to go through the National Committee on Investments that was chaired by a senior representative from MIDA, either the chairman or the CEO. But the application would eventually find its way to MOF, and the MOF officers there would have to process it. They would give the recommendations to the minister, and then the minister would only sign it into effect a couple of months later. Right, so I suggested something which I think was quite effective in expediting that process. So for those big ticket important investments coming from large multinationals like Intel and whatnot, and new investments coming in, you have a National Committee on Investments meeting that was co-chaired by the MITI minister as well as the MOF minister. And once approval is given at that level, the process of approving at MOF will be expedited. And then because the Minister of Finance is already familiar with the discussions of these FDI cases, once he sees the file, he can easily just sign it off. Whereas now, he has to ask his officer to explain what was the background behind this investment, who are the investment companies, how much are they investing. But unfortunately, once the change in government occurred in 2020, this process was stopped and it converted back to the old process, which I think wasn't so efficient. Another way that I think we left our mark was to establish a special Chinese investment channel that was part under an agency called InvestKL, whereby they were given additional budget allocation to increase their share of officers who could speak Chinese and who could reach out and engage with many of the investors coming from China in a much more specific manner, whether it's manufacturing or services. And unfortunately, once the government changed in 2020, this special channel was abolished and the budget allocation was taken away from InvestKL. So I think the leadership on these nitty-gritty and some of the finer points is important. And I hope that we have an opportunity to be back in government to be able to effect some of these changes that matters at the granular level to the investing community coming from the top.
Right, thank you, Ming. And Dr. Tham, would you like to add anything?
Yes, on the first question on the lobbying groups, because I have 40 years of academic work, so my history is a bit longer than Dr. Ong's. So the influence of Martin Kor and Jomo can be traced back to the Asian financial crisis under Mahathir first time as Prime Minister. During the Asian financial crisis, there was a globalization unit set up in EPU, and it's supposed to advise the minister on globalization and the AFC and all that. And it was at that point in time that Martin Kor and Jomo came in to advise him. So the influence on Mahathir had long roots in that sense, that went beyond the current situation. I also think that if we look at lobby groups, the politicization of issues in Malaysia, for example, I know that the media played up a lot on the Bumiputra issues and free trade agreements, that the CPTPP would somehow put aside the Bumiputra issues, even though time and again the minister, Asmin Ali, responded to that. And it is true, it's not so, because the agreement has a complete carve-out on the Bumiputra issue, you see. So that is the politicization of the free trade agreements in Malaysia. On the second one, on the Indonesia and Vietnam, I think that yes, Indonesia and Vietnam are growing economies and they have the advantage of their size to Malaysia. So with growing per capita income and growing middle income, so purchasing power is important, and market-seeking investments are going into the country as opposed to Malaysia. So there is that advantage that they have. On the labor issues, I actually think that, half the foreign workers are illegal, and my household help has always told me, it doesn't matter if they send me back, I just come back by another boat under another passport. So I think this whole argument about the foreign workers between the two countries doesn't take that into account, that labor will go where it can find work and where it can be paid higher wages. You just look at the labor flows between JB and Singapore. So you know that labor flows will go where it is needed and where it is paid better. Trade policy and fundamentals, I actually think that the bureaucrats in MITI are quite good, well-trained. They can, with the authorization to proceed with FTA agreements, negotiation actually proceed. You just need the directive from the top to say they approve. And likewise with Maidan, it's well established institution, and the bureaucrats are actually well trained. Unless you have a directive that steers them in a completely different direction, it would be, I think, business as usual for the bureaucrats. Yeah, thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Tham and Kian Ming. Now, may I invite questions from the audience here? Do you have a question? Okay, thank you. And you, Siew?
Okay, yes. First of all, I want to thank both speakers, Dr. Ong and Dr. Tham, for the breadth of perspective that you gave. I was sort of thinking more in line of how domestic politics kind of impact on foreign policy, which is something that you touched on a little bit, Dr. Ong, with regards to increasingly sort of fragmented center government, and how that sort of leads to different coalitions and different parties pursuing their own domestic and foreign policy agendas. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that. And also a second question, since Malaysia is also a federation, so relatedly, do you sort of see differences at the state level, at the level of the state government, in how they approach, say, the US and China that differs from the federal level, maybe on issues of trade, investments, and also perhaps some security issues? So in other words, also, how do you see the federal government sort of facilitating economic or investment deals towards states? So how do they prioritize states' interests in that sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Excellent questions. You've opened up the door for me to talk about domestic policy impact on foreign policy with regards to different thinking and different centers of power. Using an example that I am quite familiar with, which is the rollout of 5G in Malaysia. And I think this is a contentious issue globally. From a foreign policy perspective, we obviously know the players involved and the strong lobbying that has taken place, especially in Western countries and also in the region by America, by the US government, and also to a certain extent by certain EU governments and the EU with regards to the companies that would be selected have been selected to roll out 5G. So from Malaysia's using Malaysia as an example, during Pakatan Harapan's time in government, we proposed quite a unique model to roll out 5G, which is called a single wholesale network model, which is one single entity having the responsibility of coordinating 5G rollout. And our understanding at that time was that we would ask the different telco players in Malaysia to buy a stake in this single entity. And that single entity would be governed by certain KPIs that would be set by the relevant government agency or regulatory body under, and this would be the Ministry of Communications, one of the agencies under the Ministry of Communications. Sometime earlier this year, actually, end of last year, because there was a change in Prime Minister, the Minister in charge of communications also changed. And one of the things that he proposed was to reopen negotiations with regards to this single wholesale network and that time the contract had already been awarded to a European company, Ericsson. Of course, under Muhyiddin, the single wholesale network model, instead of being owned by telcos, there was a decision made that it will be 100% owned by an entity called Digital National Berhad, that is 100% owned by the Ministry of Finance. The understanding then was that having an entity that's 100% controlled by the government would be able to allow this entity to push for faster 5G rollout, as compared to allowing the telcos to influence their spending patterns and wanting to focus more on the urban areas. So when the new minister came in and wanted to reopen this negotiation, that view was objected by the Minister of Finance, because the Minister of Finance knew that if you had a second player come in, the original idea would be disrupted, and the original entity that would be 100% owned by that is 100% owned by the Ministry of Finance, the financial viability of the model will collapse. Right, so you had these two different contending ministers trying to sort this out, and I came out with a couple of comments and questions of my own, addressed to the CEO of DNB, and also addressed to the telco players. I also read reports that certain for foreign embassies, and there were 4 countries that were listed in a report, Malay Mail report, that said that the ambassadors of these countries wrote a letter to the Prime Minister saying that reopening the contract would affect Malaysia's investment reputation, because this would be a breach of contract and things like that. Right. So you had a case of different power centers within the government, coming out to disagree with one another, and also foreign policy inputs coming in from other countries. And I think at the end of the day, the discussion was had, a compromise was made. We'll still continue with the single wholesale network model in Malaysia, but the telcos would be allowed to purchase a stake in that entity. They are still undergoing discussions. 30th of June is the deadline for when the telcos have to submit their sort of like requests on how much they want to take up and at what price. And I think this will be an ongoing issue from a foreign policy perspective. But I think the domestic argument has already been won. MOF, I think, has won the day, and that this single entity that's 100% owned by MOF will continue to operate, perhaps with changing ownership structures. So yeah, that's just one example. I'm sure that there will be a lot of other examples that can be uncovered by other policy observers and thinkers, and this will, I think, continue if, let's say, Ismail Sabri somehow manages to stay on as Prime Minister until next year, and perhaps even beyond. You also mentioned a very important point with regards to differences at the state level vis-a-vis the federal government with regards to foreign direct investments. So I can give another example from a Sarawak perspective. So Sarawak, their model of industrialization is very different from Peninsular Malaysia, in the sense that they are much more dependent on cheap energy. So the building of Bakun Dam was one of the strategies that was started under Dr. Mahathir and fully implemented over the past 10 years or so. So Bakun, you have about 7 or 8 very, very large scale resource intensive, such as companies or factories, such as one of the largest aluminium processing factories in the whole of Southeast Asia operating there. Sarawak government clearly wants to expand their footprint from a manufacturing perspective. But there are also domestic concerns that the federal government may not necessarily see eye to eye with. And I'll give you a very specific example. There was and still is a proposal by a Chinese consortium that wanted to invest in a steelmaking facility in Sarawak.
Yean, is it?
I don't want to
okay.
Okay, but it was not approved when I was deputy minister,
right.
And it would have been the largest steel manufacturing company in the factory in the whole of Malaysia, dwarfing even Alliance by a magnitude of 2. The Sarawak government was pushing for it, but federal government had reservations because we knew that some of this would some of the supplies would find itself into the domestic market and would have an impact on the domestic market as well, because that's just inevitable. You call prevent a company that is operating within the borders of Malaysia from selling into the Malaysian market, right? So and this kind of tensions I think will continue, including, for example, in the area of ports development. If Sabah and Sarawak, say that, federal government is not willing to pump in money for ports development, if let's say the Chinese, some Chinese interests are willing to pump in the money and couple it with manufacturing investments, who are you to say that who is the federal government to prevent this? And then the federal government would think of things that from this perspective, not just from a perspective of manufacturing investments, but there are security concerns, especially if, let's say, it's a port in Sabah, right? Or upgrading or taking over a port in Sabah, let's say the Sepangga port, for example, right? So I think these kinds of dynamics will continue to will continue to play itself out and will continue to be interesting points of contention and discussion, in Malaysia.
Thank you, Kian Ming. Dr. Tham, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll go to the online questions.
Oh, I just have a quick question, a quick comment that the federal and state relations and that all the states actually want investment and trade. So they also pursue for trade and investment on their own. But that does not necessarily take into consideration national issues such as security, like Dr. Ong has said. So for example, you can see the Malacca port, gateway or whatever that they're having down there. From the state point of view, they want to draw in FDI for the development of the state. But again, having a port there and what it means in terms of national security and relationship with other countries, I don't think that is in the configuration of the state.
Thank you. That's an interesting example as well. So now my colleague, senior analyst Naval, will help to moderate the online questions. Naval, would you like to convey the questions?
Yes, please. Thank you, Ariel. And thank you, Dr. Ong, for your insights. And thank you, Dr. Tham, for furthering the discussion. I'm going to dive straight into the Q&A. And I'm going to read the questions as they are. The first question is for Dr. Ong. How do you summarize the trend of FDI in Malaysia under COVID, except for decrease from China? Are there any sectoral differences?
Okay, thanks, Ming Ting. I think the trends under COVID is still being played out, but what I've shown just now is increase in EU as well as US investments, and I expect that to continue, especially in the E&E sector. I think what would be interesting for me is to see how the balance would change once China opens up, because the interest would be tremendous. But at the same time, is Malaysian Malaysian sort of like parameters that we've set for investments in the manufacturing sector robust enough to be able to filter out various applications coming from China and perhaps even the other countries as well, because the scale of Chinese investments in Malaysia in the manufacturing sector is huge. As Deputy Minister, I made it a point to visit every single state, every single major investment in the manufacturing sector from China that had a factory of a certain size. So I went to Johor, I went to a Yean factory there, I went to a couple of glass manufacturing factories in Negeri Sembilan as well as Malacca. I went to Lion Steel, obviously, in Pahang. I went to Perak, where the rail company that was rolling out some of the rolling stock in Malaysia had some operations there as well. So the challenge for Malaysia is actually not just to accept any investment willy-nilly, but be able to selectively target certain investment types and also to certain locations. What I said just now about Sabah and Sarawak, I think remains relevant in the sense that the challenges of increasing manufacturing presence, especially in Sabah, where only 7% of the state's economy is in manufacturing, needs to be increased and enhanced. But at the same time, what are the challenges in terms of the kind of conditions that these Chinese investments would set in places like Sabah and Sarawak. These are some of the nuances that I think we need to look at in 2021 2022 moving forward. I also answered a question online, which is by Nicholas, which asked, what do I think about Malaysia skipping Biden's Democracy Summit? Will there be long-term implications to this? I think the quick answer would be no long-term implications because, Malaysia, Ismail Sabri was invited to DC and then later on to Tokyo, and Malaysia is too important of a partner, for the US in the region to be ignored or to be quote-unquote punished. But I do want to say that internally and as well as to certain foreign policy watchers, the fact that Malaysia did not have a very strategic approach towards this democracy summit showed perhaps a lack of focus on the part of Wisma Putra and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Malaysia, because Ismail Sabri or even the foreign minister could have easily pre-recorded a statement in English or even in Bahasa Malaysia and talk about the things that Ismail Sabri's government was doing to increase the level the playing field from a political perspective, because he did sign the MOU. He was pushing for greater reforms in Parliament, aided by Pakatan Harapan, obviously. So these were things that could have been highlighted and showcased during the Democracy Summit. And it would have been consistent with the flexible approach that I talked about, whereby Ismail Sabri could have scored some brownie points at the international level. But during the same weekend as the Democracy Summit was also the celebration of 100 days of Ismail Sabri's government. So he chose to prioritize that over the Democracy Summit. But like I said, he could have easily, recorded a message. And I think I put the sort of like oversight here squarely on the shoulders of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Minister.
Right, thank you, Dr. I think we have time for one last question. This one is from Giant Menon. While the current administration may be pro-trade and investment, there have been calls from various quarters questioning the need to return to pre-pandemic levels of foreign workers. Could Dr. Ong comment on the likely future of policy on foreign labor in Malaysia?
Okay, so I think I just need to update a little bit about the number of foreign workers in Malaysia, both legal and illegal, that was mentioned by Siew earlier. Prior to the pandemic, there were about 2 million legal foreign workers in Malaysia working across different sectors. And the estimates was that there were about 2 million illegal workers, people who have overstayed, people who came in without documentation. But we do not have a very good estimate in terms of how many foreign workers left Malaysia during the pandemic. Estimates could be 500,000 to 1 million. So you could have seen about 25 to 30% of the foreign labor force leaving or having left Malaysia, which is why there's such a big shortfall of foreign workers in Malaysia. Singapore, I think, is facing certain similar challenges as well. In the context where there are global supply chain challenges, inflationary pressures in Malaysia, I think there is a need to push for the speedy processing of foreign labor applications in Malaysia, just to replace some of the lost even legal workers that have left Malaysia. So this doesn't mean that we have to return to the pre-pandemic level of foreign workers, especially those who are illegal. Notwithstanding what Siew said earlier about very easy, being easy to come back to Malaysia through illegal channels, I think there's still some dangers and costs to be paid there. I do think that we need to have a more sensible approach in terms of not being too close to foreign labor coming back to Malaysia. But at the same time, I think because of the increase in minimum wage and other cost-related issues, including the need to house foreign workers in properly registered and also approved for labor quarters, I think the pressure on the manufacturers and other industries in Malaysia is to increase their investments in automation. So I've spoken to a couple of players in the retail as well as manufacturing sectors. They are actually much more willing to invest in automation now. And this is a policy that was pushed for under Pakatan Harapan's time with regards to Industry 4.0 in MITI. And I was one of the very strong champions of this program, and I continue to be a strong champion of this program. So if let's say we can have that concurrently, have a good flow of foreign workers coming in to replace those who have left, and at the same time undertake a robust and aggressive automation and Industry 4.0 program, then we can have hopefully the best of both worlds.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ong. I'm going to pass the time back to Ariel now to close the webinar.
Thank you, Naval. Before that, does Dr. Tham have anything to add to that last question, just in case?
No, it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Naval, and everybody. We hope that you have enjoyed yourselves and found this useful. I would like to thank Dr. Ong, Dr. Tham, and our participants for giving us your time. I would also like to thank Naval, Sylvia, and Frankie for making this event possible. Have a good day, everybody.